What if I told you that while my family thought I was wasting my life on some aimless sabbatical, I was secretly building a $4 billion empire? Tonight, at their own gala, a magazine cover would shatter everything they believed about their disappointment of a daughter. This is the story of how I went from family failure to Forbes front page, and trust me, you won't see this ending coming. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the marble floor of the Metropolitan Club's grand ballroom, each shard reflecting the glittering facade of Manhattan's financial elite. I stood at the edge of it all, nursing a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching my family work the room like they owned it. Which, in many ways, they did. My name is Isabella Clarke, but everyone calls me Bella. And if that last name sounds familiar, it should. The Clarke family has been shaping Wall Street for 4 generations. My great-grandfather founded Clarke & Associates in 1932, right after the crash. My grandfather expanded it into international markets. My father turned it into the powerhouse investment firm that manages over $200 billion in assets today. And then there's me, 29 years old MIT graduate, and according to my family, the biggest disappointment in Clarke history. Tonight was our annual family gala, the kind of event where senators shake hands with hedge fund kings, where billion-dollar deals get sketched on cocktail napkins, where the future of American finance gets decided over aged whiskey and imported caviar. 300 of the most powerful people in New York were here, all dressed in their finest, all playing the same elegant game of power and influence. I smoothed down my black Valentino dress, the one my mother had insisted I wear because, quote, "At least if you're going to embarrass us, you can look respectable doing it." The fabric was beautiful, sure, but it felt like armor. I didn't want to wear protection for a battle I was tired of fighting. My cousin Marcus stood near the bar, surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers. He was 32, Harvard Business School, and currently the golden boy managing the European division of Clarke & Associates. His laugh carried across the room, that confident boom that commanded attention. Even from 50 feet away, I could see him gesturing animatedly, probably telling some story about closing a massive deal or outsmarting a competitor. Marcus had always been everything my parents wanted in a child. Ambitious, ruthless, when necessary, and completely devoted to the family business. He lived and breathed finance, could talk derivatives and currency swaps at dinner parties, and never once questioned whether this was the life he actually wanted. Meanwhile, I'd spent the last 18 months on what everyone politely called my sabbatical. What they less politely called behind closed doors was my quarter-life crisis, my phase, my pathetic attempt to find myself. They had no idea what I'd actually been doing with my time. None of them did. The orchestra struck up a gentle waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. My parents were across the room, my mother resplendent in navy silk, my father distinguished in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Charlotte and Philip Clarke, power couple, extraordinaire. They were holding court near the windows that overlooked Central Park, surrounded by other banking dynasties, other families whose names appeared on the letterheads of Fortune 500 companies. I watched my mother lean in to whisper something to Mrs. Hamilton, probably some piece of gossip or business intelligence. My father was deep in conversation with the Secretary of the Treasury, their heads bent together over what I assumed was some matter of national economic importance. This was their element, their natural habitat. They moved through these events like dancers who'd rehearsed the same routine for decades. But then I caught my mother's eye across the room, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Not pride, not even affection, just a kind of resigned disappointment, the look you might give a broken piece of jewelry you keep meaning to fix but never quite get around to, that look. God, that look had been haunting me since I was 12 years old. I took a small sip of champagne, letting the bubbles burn slightly on my tongue, and tried to remember why I'd agreed to come tonight. Oh, right, because my father had called it a family obligation. Because my mother had said it would look strange if I didn't show up. Because even in my rebellion, I was still trying to be the good daughter, still hoping that maybe this time would be different. The truth was, I used to love these events when I was younger. I'd wear my prettiest dress and feel so grown up walking into these grand ballrooms. I'd watch my parents command respect from some of the most powerful people in the world, and I'd think someday, that'll be me. Someday I'll be that confident, that successful, that important. But somewhere along the way, the magic had worn off. Maybe it was during college when I discovered that there were other ways to make a difference in the world. Maybe it was during my brief stint at Clarke and Associates right after graduation, when I realized that moving money around for rich people to get richer wasn't exactly what I'd call fulfilling. Or maybe it was just the slow, crushing realization that no matter how hard I tried, I'd never be the daughter they actually wanted. A server appeared at my elbow with a tray of appetizers, some kind of elaborate seafood creation that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. I shook my head with a polite smile and watched him glide away toward a group of oil executives who were debating the future of energy markets. Everything here was a performance: the clothes, the conversations, the carefully orchestrated networking. Even the charity aspect of tonight's gala felt hollow. Yes, we were raising money for financial literacy programs in underserved communities, which was genuinely important work. But the amount we'd spend on this one evening, on the flowers and the food and the entertainment, could have funded those programs for months. I'd tried to bring this up to my parents, once suggesting we could have a simpler event and donate more of the money directly to the cause. My mother had looked at me like I'd suggested we hold the gala in a McDonald's parking lot. "Bella, darling," she'd said in that patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children, "the spectacle is part of the appeal. People give more when they feel they're part of something exclusive." Maybe she was right. Maybe I just didn't understand the game well enough. But watching all these millionaires and billionaires pat themselves on the back for their generosity, while servers who probably made minimum wage cleared their plates, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all just playing dress-up, pretending our excess was somehow noble. The music shifted to something more contemporary, and I noticed Marcus detaching himself from his admirers and walking in my direction. My stomach tightened. These family gatherings were bad enough without having to endure one of his lectures about responsibility and family loyalty. He approached with that easy confidence that had always come so naturally to him. His tuxedo perfectly fitted his hair, styled in that classic Wall Street executive look that said serious but approachable. Marcus had always been handsome in a conventional way, the kind of guy who looked like he should be on the cover of a business magazine, which actually he had been twice. "Bella," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek in greeting. His cologne was expensive and subtle, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. "You look beautiful tonight. That dress is stunning on you." "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. Compliments from Marcus always felt like the opening move in a chess game I didn't want to play. "So," he continued, signaling the bartender for what I knew would be his usual whiskey neat, "how's the sabbatical going, still figuring things out?" There it was. The question I'd been dreading all evening, delivered with just enough concern to seem caring, and just enough condescension to sting. Marcus had a talent for making his judgment sound like genuine interest. "It's going well," I said, simply not offering any details. I'd learned that the less I said about my time away from the family business, the less ammunition I gave him for his inevitable lecture about wasted potential and family expectations. But Marcus wasn't easily deterred. He accepted his whiskey from the bartender and took a small sip before continuing. "You know, I was talking to your father earlier. He mentioned you've been doing some kind of consulting work. Something with computers. The way he said computers made it sound like I'd taken up finger painting or learned to juggle." I could feel my jaw tightening, but I forced myself to stay calm. Getting defensive would only prove his point about my immaturity. "Something like that," I said. "Bella, can I be honest with you for a minute?" Marcus moved closer, lowering his voice as if he were about to share some profound wisdom. "I know you're trying to find yourself or whatever, but don't you think 18 months is long enough? I mean, you graduated from MIT, for God's sake. You have one of the best business minds I've ever seen, even if you don't want to admit it. The family needs you. The business needs you. I stared at him, this golden boy who'd never questioned a single expectation placed on him, who'd never wondered if there might be more to life than profit margins and market domination. How could I explain to someone like Marcus that success wasn't just about money, that maybe I wanted to build something that mattered for reasons beyond shareholder value? Marcus, I said carefully, I appreciate your concern, but I'm exactly where I need to be right now. He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Come on, Bella. What are you actually doing? And please don't tell me you're still playing around with those startup ideas you mentioned at Christmas. We both know how that's going to end. The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. This was Marcus at his worst, when he forgot to hide his arrogance behind charm and concern. This was the cousin who'd spent our childhood explaining why my ideas wouldn't work, why my dreams weren't practical, why I should just accept that some people were meant to follow and others were meant to lead. You know what your problem is, he continued, clearly warming to his theme. You're afraid of commitment. You're afraid of failing, so you'd rather drift around pretending to be some kind of entrepreneur than actually put yourself on the line for something real. The words hit harder than I expected, mainly because there was just enough truth in them to sting. I had been afraid for a long time. Afraid of failing, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of discovering that maybe I wasn't as smart or capable as everyone had always said I was. But that was before I'd found my team, before I'd built something that actually worked, before I'd proven to myself that I could create something meaningful from nothing. I looked at Marcus with his expensive whiskey and his expensive suit and his expensive assumptions about what success looked like, and I felt something shift inside me. A kind of quiet certainty, a steel spine I hadn't known I possessed. You know, what, Marcus? I said, my voice perfectly calm. You're absolutely right. I have been afraid. Afraid of settling for something that would slowly kill my soul just because it pays well and makes my parents proud. His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features. This wasn't the defensive reaction he'd been expecting. But I'm not afraid anymore, I continued, and I'm definitely not aimless. I know exactly what I'm doing and exactly where I'm going. The question is, do you, for just a moment? Marcus looked genuinely uncertain, like maybe he'd miscalculated this entire conversation, but then his mask slipped back into place, that confident smirk that had always been his default expression when he felt challenged. Well, he said, raising his glass in a mock toast, here's to finding your way, cousin. I just hope you figure it out before you waste any more of your prime earning years. He walked away, then probably to find someone who would appreciate his wit and wisdom more than I had. I watched him go. This man who thought he understood everything about success and failure, about family and loyalty, about what it meant to make something of yourself in this world. If only he knew. If only any of them knew what I'd been building while they thought I was drifting aimlessly through my extended adolescence. But they'd find out soon enough. They'd all find out very, very soon. I finished my champagne in one long swallow and set the empty glass on a passing server's tray. The night was still young and I had a role to play until it was over. The dutiful daughter, the wayward cousin, the family disappointment who couldn't quite figure out her place in the world. But as I moved through that glittering ballroom surrounded by all that wealth and power and certainty, I carried with me a secret that would change everything. A secret that would turn their understanding of success and failure, of tradition and innovation, completely upside down. I just had to wait a little bit longer, just a little bit longer, and then they'd see exactly what their aimless Bella had been up to during her sabbatical. Standing in that ballroom watching Marcus walk away with his smug certainty intact, I couldn't help but think back to when things were simpler. When I actually believed that being a Clarke meant something special, something worth aspiring to. I was 7 years old the first time I understood what our family name really meant. We were living in the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the one that took up the entire top two floors of a pre-war building overlooking Central Park. 4,200 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that made Manhattan look like our personal kingdom. That particular morning, I'd woken up early and padded downstairs to the kitchen in my pajamas, expecting to find Maria, our housekeeper, making breakfast. Instead, I found my father at the enormous granite island, still in his pajamas too, reading 3 different newspapers while drinking his coffee. "Morning, sweetheart," he said without looking up from the Wall Street Journal. "You're up early." "Daddy, why do all the newspapers have your name in them?" He smiled, then the kind of smile that adults give children when they ask unexpectedly smart questions. He folded the paper and patted his lap, and I climbed up, suddenly feeling very important. "Because Daddy helps people with their money," he explained, pointing to an article about Clarke and Associates' latest acquisition. "And when you help enough people in the right way, the newspapers want to write about it." "Are we rich?" I asked with all the bluntness that only a 7-year-old can manage. My father laughed, a sound I rarely heard in those days. "Bella, sweetheart, being rich isn't about having money. It's about having responsibility. Our family has been taking care of other people's money for almost 100 years. That's a big responsibility." I remember feeling so proud in that moment, like I was part of something important and noble. My father wasn't just making money, he was helping people. We weren't just rich, we were responsible. By the time I was 10, I'd learned that responsibility came with expectations, lots of them. "Bella, darling, sit up straight," my mother would say during our formal family dinners. "Clarks have good posture." "Bella, you need to speak more clearly," she'd continue. "People need to understand every word you say if you're going to be taken seriously." "Bella, that dress is too casual for dinner. We have standards to maintain." My mother, Charlotte Clarke, was a force of nature disguised as a perfectly put-together executive. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, built her own investment banking division from scratch, and could negotiate million-dollar deals while wearing 6-inch heels and never breaking a sweat. She was everything a modern woman was supposed to be: successful and elegant and uncompromising. But she was also terrifying, not in an obvious way. She never yelled, never lost her temper, never showed any emotion that wasn't carefully calculated for maximum effect. Instead, she had this way of looking at you when you disappointed her, this cool assessment that made you feel like you were being appraised and found wanting. I got that look a lot. When I was 12, I came home from school excited about a computer programming class they were offering as an elective. I'd always been good with technology, and the idea of building something from code seemed magical to me. "Absolutely not," my mother said when I asked if I could sign up. "You're already taking piano and French and debate team. You don't have time for hobbies." "But Mom, it's not a hobby. It's like the future. Everything's going to be run by computers soon." She gave me that look, the one that said I was being naive and childish. "Bella, computers are tools. Important tools, certainly, but tools nonetheless. Leaders don't operate tools, they direct the people who operate them. You're being groomed to be a leader." That was my mother in a nutshell. Everything was about leadership, about being in control, about maintaining the family's position at the top of the food chain. The idea that I might want to actually build something with my own hands, to understand how things worked from the ground up, was incomprehensible to her. My father was different, but not necessarily easier to please. Philip Clarke was old-school Wall Street, the kind of man who'd made his first million before he turned 30 and his first billion before he turned 50. He had this way of turning every conversation into a teaching moment about business strategy or market dynamics. "Tell me, Bella," he'd say over dinner when I was 14, "what do you think about the Federal Reserve's recent interest rate decision?" And I'd have to have an opinion because Clark's always had opinions about economic policy. Even when I was more interested in talking about the book I was reading or the science project I was working on, I had to pivot to discussions about monetary policy and global markets. "Good answer," he'd say when I managed to string together something coherent about inflation and economic growth. "But," Have you considered the implications for emerging markets? What about currency fluctuations in developing economies? It wasn't enough to be smart. I had to be smart about the right things, interested in the right subjects, passionate about the right causes. And the right causes were always somehow related to finance. The worst part was Marcus. My cousin Marcus, who was 3 years older and seemed to absorb everything our parents taught him like a sponge designed specifically for financial knowledge. Marcus lived with us for 2 years, when I was 13 and he was 16. His parents, my father's brother and sister-in-law, had died in a car accident, and we were his closest family. I thought having someone closer to my age in the house might make things more fun, more normal. I was so wrong. Marcus was like a miniature version of my father, except without any of the warmth or humor that my dad occasionally showed. He talked about compound interest the way other teenagers talked about sports. He read the Financial Times for fun. He actually enjoyed our formal family dinners, treating them like seminars where he could demonstrate his growing expertise. Uncle Philip. He'd say, "I've been thinking about your analysis of the tech sector, and I wonder if you've considered the potential for disruption in traditional banking models." And my father would light up like Marcus had just solved world hunger. "Excellent observation, Marcus. Tell me more about your thinking." Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there picking at my food, wondering why nobody ever asked me what I'd been thinking about. Probably because they knew I'd been thinking about the neural network algorithms I'd been reading about, or the robotics competition I wanted to enter, or literally anything other than banking models and market disruption. The comparison was constant and exhausting. Marcus excelled at everything that mattered to our family. He got perfect grades in all his business and economics classes. He interned at Goldman Sachs when he was 17. He chose Harvard Business School over MIT, Stanford, and Wharton because he said Harvard had the best connections for someone planning to revolutionize international finance. And then, there was me getting accepted to MIT with a full scholarship and choosing to study artificial intelligence instead of business. "I don't understand this decision, Bella," my mother said when I told them about my college plans. We were in my father's study, the room where all important family discussions took place. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on economics and finance, a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to my great-grandfather, and oil paintings of stern-looking men who'd built the Clarke legacy. "MIT is an excellent school," my father said carefully. "But artificial intelligence, what exactly do you plan to do with that and change the world?" I said with all the confidence and naivety of an 18-year-old who thought she had everything figured out. My parents exchanged one of those looks, the kind that parents share when their child has announced they want to be a professional unicorn trainer. "Bella, sweetheart," my mother said in her most patient voice, "changing the world is admirable, but you need to be practical. You need to think about your future, about the family business, about your responsibilities." "What if my responsibilities include making sure the family business doesn't become obsolete?" I shot back. "What if artificial intelligence is going to revolutionize finance whether we want it to or not, and someone in this family should probably understand how it works?" That got their attention. For about 30 seconds, I thought I'd actually made a compelling argument. "1 year," my father said finally. "Try it for 1 year. If you hate it, you transfer to the business school. If you love it, we'll discuss how to apply it to the family business." It felt like a victory at the time. Looking back, I realized they were just buying time, convinced that I'd get bored with all the technical stuff and come running back to the comfortable world of spreadsheets and profit margins. Marcus, meanwhile, was thriving at Harvard. Every time he came home for holidays, he had new stories about his professors, his classmates, his internships. He spoke fluent business, now could analyze market trends and corporate strategies with the kind of casual expertise that made my parents beam with pride. Marcus closed a mock deal worth $50 million in his advanced corporate finance class. My mother announced at dinner during his junior year. His professor said it was the most sophisticated analysis he'd seen from an undergraduate. "That's wonderful," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. I just finished building a machine learning algorithm that can predict stock market volatility with 87% accuracy. That's nice, dear, my mother replied, already turning back to Marcus. Tell us more about this professor of yours. Didn't you say he used to work for Morgan Stanley? And that was how it always went. Marcus's achievements were victories for the family, proof that we were maintaining our standards and our legacy. My achievements were hobbies, interesting little side projects that might someday be useful, but weren't really serious. The breaking point came during my senior year at MIT. I'd been working on my thesis, a project that combined artificial intelligence with financial fraud detection. It was groundbreaking work, the kind of thing that could revolutionize how banks and investment firms protected themselves and their clients. I was so excited to show my parents. I'd prepared a whole presentation complete with charts and graphs and real-world applications. I thought this would finally be the moment when they understood that what I was doing wasn't just some academic exercise, that it had real value for the world they cared about. It's very impressive, Bella, my father said when I finished my presentation. Very technical. Technical, I repeated. Dad, this could save banks millions of dollars in fraud losses. It could protect ordinary people from having their life savings stolen by sophisticated criminals. This isn't just technical, it's revolutionary. I'm sure it is, my mother said. But Bella, you need to think about what comes next. You can't build a career on one thesis project. You need to join a firm, learn how business actually works, understand how to manage people and resources and client relationships. Marcus just got offered a position at Clarke and Associates, my father added. Starting salary is $200,000 plus bonuses. He'll be working directly under me, learning the business from the ground up. And there it was. The path they'd always envisioned for me, laid out in Marcus's footsteps. Join the family firm, learn the traditional way of doing things, eventually take over and continue the legacy exactly as it had always been. The problem was, I could see what they couldn't. I could see that the world was changing faster than they realized, that artificial intelligence and machine learning weren't just tools for tech companies anymore. They were going to transform every industry, including finance. And the firms that adapted first were going to dominate the future, while the ones that stuck to traditional methods were going to become irrelevant. But trying to explain that to my parents was like trying to explain color to someone who'd been blind their entire life. They couldn't see it because they didn't want to see it, because admitting that the world was changing meant admitting that everything they'd built their lives around might not be permanent. I need some time to think, I told them. What's there to think about? My mother asked. You're a Clarke. This is what Clarks do. But that was exactly the problem. Being a Clarke meant following a script that had been written long before I was born, playing a role that had been designed for someone else, someone who wanted the same things they wanted and valued the same things they valued. What if I wanted to write my own script? What if I wanted to use the Clarke name to build something new instead of just maintaining something old? That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking out at Central Park and the city lights beyond, and I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to take that sabbatical they thought was so foolish. I was going to use the trust fund money they thought I was wasting, and I was going to prove to them, to Marcus, to everyone, that there was more than one way to honor a family legacy. I was going to build something that would make them proud whether they understood it or not. And I was going to do it my way, using everything they'd taught me about leadership and responsibility and excellence, but applying it to a vision they couldn't see yet. It would take 18 months, but I was going to show them that their aimless daughter had been building the future while they were still arguing about the past. The decision to build my future outside the family business didn't happen overnight. It took 4 years at MIT to fully understand what I was walking away from, and more importantly, what I was walking toward. MIT was like stepping into an entirely different universe. Where my family valued tradition and established methods, MIT worshipped innovation and disruption. Where the Clarke penthouse was all marble and mahogany and old-world elegance, the AI lab was fluorescent lights and whiteboards covered in equations and servers humming with computational power. I'll never forget my first day in Dr. Aaron Patel's Advanced Machine Learning seminar. The classroom was packed with some of the brightest minds I'd ever encountered, graduate students and undergraduates who spoke about neural networks and deep learning algorithms the way my family talked about market trends and investment strategies. Dr. Patel himself was nothing like the professors I'd imagined. He was young, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an energy that was absolutely infectious. He'd made his fortune building AI systems for tech giants before returning to academia, and he had this way of making the most complex concepts feel like exciting puzzles waiting to be solved. Artificial intelligence. He said that first day writing the words on the whiteboard with almost ceremonial precision is not about replacing human intelligence. It's about amplifying it. It's about taking our capacity for pattern recognition, for learning, for adaptation, and scaling it beyond anything we've ever imagined. He turned to face the class, and his eyes seemed to find each of us individually. You're here because you see possibilities that others can't see yet. You're here because you understand that we're on the brink of a technological revolution that will transform every aspect of human society. The question is, what are you going to do with that understanding? I knew the answer immediately, even though I couldn't have articulated it at the time. I was going to bridge two worlds. I was going to take everything my family had taught me about finance and business and combine it with everything I was learning about artificial intelligence. I was going to prove that innovation and tradition didn't have to be enemies. The next 3.5 years were the most challenging and exhilarating of my life. While Marcus was learning about corporate hierarchies and market analysis at Harvard, I was diving deep into machine learning algorithms, natural language processing, and predictive modeling. While he was networking at business school mixers, I was pulling all-nighters in the lab, debugging code and testing theories. But here's what my parents didn't understand, what they couldn't see from their perspective on Fifth Avenue. I wasn't abandoning everything they'd taught me. I was applying it in ways they'd never imagined. All those formal dinners where my father had drilled me on economic theory, that gave me the foundational knowledge to understand how AI could revolutionize financial markets. All those lessons from my mother about leadership and strategic thinking that helped me envision applications that purely technical people might miss. Dr. Patel saw it immediately. During my sophomore year, I was struggling with a particularly complex project involving algorithmic trading systems. I'd been approaching it from a purely computational angle, trying to optimize for speed and accuracy. But something wasn't clicking. "Tell me about your background," Dr. Patel said during our one-on-one meeting in his office. The walls were covered with whiteboards full of equations, and his desk was cluttered with research papers and half-empty coffee cups. So I told him about the Clarke family legacy, about growing up surrounded by financial expertise, about understanding markets and investment strategies from a very early age. I was worried he'd think less of me, that he'd see me as just another rich kid playing around with technology. Instead, his face lit up like I'd just handed him the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for years. "Bella," he said, leaning forward with excitement, "do you realize what you have? You have deep domain expertise in one of the most complex and important sectors of the global economy, combined with cutting-edge technical skills. That's incredibly rare. Most AI researchers understand the technology, but not the business applications. Most finance professionals understand the business, but not the technological possibilities." That conversation changed everything. Dr. Patel became more than just a professor. He became a mentor who helped me see that my unusual background wasn't a burden to overcome, but an advantage to leverage. Under his guidance, my senior thesis project took shape. I was building an AI system that could detect sophisticated financial fraud in real time using machine learning algorithms to identify patterns that human analysts would miss. It was technically complex enough to satisfy the computer science requirements, but practically valuable enough to have real-world applications. The system I developed could analyze millions of transactions simultaneously, looking for subtle anomalies that might indicate money laundering, embezzlement, or other financial crimes. It could learn from new data, continuously adapting to evolving criminal strategies faster than traditional rule-based systems. When I presented my thesis defense, the room was packed. Not just with computer science faculty, but with professors from the business school, representatives from financial institutions, and even some federal agents who specialized in financial crimes. The presentation went perfectly. My system performed flawlessly, detecting fraud attempts that had stumped traditional systems while maintaining an incredibly low false positive rate. The questions from the committee were challenging but fair, and I could feel the excitement in the room as people began to understand the implications of what I'd built. "Miss Clarke," said Dr. Martinez from the business school, "have you considered the commercial applications of this technology? The market potential is enormous." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. This was something that could actually change the world. Something that could save financial institutions billions of dollars while protecting ordinary people from sophisticated criminals. After graduation, while Marcus was starting his meteoric rise at Clarke and Associates, I made a decision that horrified my parents. I turned down job offers from Google, Microsoft, and IBM to start my own company. "You're throwing away your future," my mother said when I told them about my plans. We were having one of our formal family dinners, the kind where Marcus would usually dominate the conversation with stories about his latest deals and client acquisitions. "I'm building my future," I corrected her. "Mom, what I've developed could revolutionize fraud detection across the entire financial industry. This isn't just about getting a good job. This is about creating something that matters." My father, to his credit, tried to be supportive. "Bella, what you've accomplished is impressive, but starting a company is incredibly risky. 90% of startups fail within the first 5 years. Why not license your technology to an established firm? We could make some calls, arrange meetings with the right people." "Because the right people don't understand what this technology can do," I said. "They see it as a tool to make their existing processes slightly more efficient. I see it as a way to completely reimagine how financial security works." Marcus, who'd been unusually quiet throughout this conversation, finally spoke up. "Bella, you're brilliant. Nobody's questioning that. But there's a difference between being smart and being business smart. You don't have experience raising capital, managing teams, dealing with the clients. These are skills that take years to develop." He wasn't wrong exactly. I didn't have traditional business experience. But I had something else. I had a vision that nobody else could see, backed by technical skills that nobody else in my family possessed. With Dr. Patel's help, I connected with some angel investors who specialized in fintech startups. They were intrigued by my technology, but skeptical about my ability to execute. I was 22 years old with no business experience, trying to enter one of the most regulated and conservative industries in the world. "We like the technology," said Jennifer Walsh, a partner at Catalyst Ventures, "but we're concerned about your go-to-market strategy. Financial institutions don't typically buy complex software from recent college graduates." She was right, of course. But I was determined to prove that innovation could come from unexpected places. I spent my trust fund money renting a small office in Cambridge, hiring 2 brilliant engineers who'd graduated with me and building a more robust version of my fraud detection system. We called the company Secure Stream Analytics, and for 8 months, we worked around the clock to develop a product that could compete with established players in the cybersecurity market. Those were some of the hardest months of my life. We were burning through money faster than I'd anticipated, struggling to get meetings with potential clients, and facing rejection after rejection from investors who couldn't see past my age and inexperience. The final blow came when our biggest potential client, a mid-size regional bank, decided to go with a more established cybersecurity firm instead of our innovative but unproven solution. "We appreciate your presentation," their CTO told me over the phone, "but we need a vendor with a track record. We can't take risks with our customers' financial data." I hung up that phone and sat in our empty office surrounded by whiteboards, full of algorithms and dreams that suddenly felt very fragile. My engineers were looking for new jobs. My investors were asking pointed questions about our runway. My parents were dropping subtle hints about opportunities at Clarke and Associates. For about 24 hours, I seriously considered giving up. But then I remembered something Dr. Patel had told me during one of our last meetings at MIT. Failure, he'd said, is just data. The question isn't whether you'll fail, it's what you'll learn from the failure and how you'll apply that knowledge to your next attempt. So I started analyzing what had gone wrong. SecureStream had failed not because the technology wasn't good enough, but because I'd been trying to compete in a crowded market against established players with deeper pockets and longer track records. But what if I wasn't trying to compete with existing solutions? What if I was solving a problem that nobody else was even addressing yet? That's when I had the insight that would change everything. I'd been thinking about fraud detection as a defensive measure, a way to catch criminals after they'd already begun their attacks. But what if AI could predict fraud before it happened? What if machine learning algorithms could identify vulnerabilities in financial systems before criminals had a chance to exploit them? It was a completely different approach, one that would require partnerships with financial institutions rather than competition against cybersecurity vendors. Instead of selling software, I'd be providing intelligence. Instead of replacing existing systems, I'd be enhancing them with predictive capabilities they'd never had before. I spent 3 weeks developing a prototype of this new approach using publicly available financial data to demonstrate how machine learning could identify emerging fraud patterns weeks or even months before they became serious threats. The results were extraordinary. My system could predict with 89% accuracy which types of financial institutions would be targeted by specific fraud schemes, and it could provide detailed recommendations for preventing those attacks. This wasn't just an incremental improvement over existing technology. This was a fundamental breakthrough that could transform how the entire financial industry thought about security. I remember the moment I realized I'd found my path forward. I was sitting in that same empty office at 2 a.m, looking at test results that proved my new approach worked, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since my thesis defense: absolute certainty that what I was building would change the world. I called Dr. Patel, even though it was late. "Bella," he said, his voice groggy, but instantly alert when he heard the excitement in my voice. "What's happening?" "I figured it out," I told him. "I know how to build something that nobody else can build, something that solves a problem nobody else is even trying to solve." "Tell me," he said. So I did. I explained the predictive approach, the partnership model, the potential applications across the entire financial sector. I could hear him getting more excited as I talked, asking technical questions and suggesting improvements. "This is it," he said when I finished. "This is what you were meant to build." That phone call happened 18 months ago. 18 months that my family thought I'd been wasting on some kind of quarter-life crisis, some aimless sabbatical, while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. If only they knew that I'd been building the future of financial security, one algorithm at a time. If only they knew that their aimless daughter had been about to become the youngest person ever to revolutionize an industry that had remained essentially unchanged for decades. But they'd find out soon enough. Very soon, the whole world would find out exactly what Isabella Clarke had been up to during her so-called sabbatical. The breakthrough was just the beginning. Having a revolutionary idea is one thing. Building it into something that can actually change the world is something entirely different. And I knew I couldn't do it alone. The problem was, I needed a very specific type of team, not the typical Silicon Valley founders with Stanford MBAs and venture capital connections. I needed people who thought differently, who saw opportunities where others saw obstacles, who understood what it meant to be underestimated. I found them in the most unlikely places. Layla Hassan was the first person I recruited, and honestly, she almost hung up on me when I called. I'd found her through an obscure academic paper she'd published about pattern recognition in financial datasets. The paper was brilliant, showing insights that would have impressed my MIT professors. But when I looked up her credentials, I discovered something unexpected. Layla had never been to college. She'd been homeschooled by parents who were more interested in their religious community than their daughter's education. But she'd taught herself advanced mathematics and computer science using library books and online resources. At 19, she was already doing contract work for data analytics firms, solving problems that stumped their PhD employees. "Look," she said, when I finally convinced her to meet me at a coffee shop in Harvard Square, "I don't know what kind of startup fantasy you're living, but I'm not interested in being someone's token diversity hire." Layla was small and fierce with dark eyes that seemed to see through every word you said to the motivations underneath. She wore a hijab and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from having to prove yourself every single day of your life. "I'm not looking for diversity," I told her. "I'm looking for brilliance. And your work on predictive modeling is some of the most brilliant I've ever seen." I showed her my prototype, explained my vision for predictive fraud detection, and watched her expression change from skepticism to fascination to genuine excitement. "This is insane," she said, but she was smiling. "This could actually work, but you'd need massive computational power, real-time data feeds from multiple financial institutions, and a team of people who understand both the technical and regulatory challenges." "I know," I said. "That's why I need you." She agreed to join me that afternoon, but only after making me promise that this wouldn't be one of those startups where the only woman on the team gets stuck handling marketing and customer relations while the men did the real technical work. "You want me for my brain," she said, "not because I look good in promotional photos." "Deal," I said, and I meant it. Finding our second team member was even more complicated. I needed someone who understood cybersecurity from the inside out. Someone who knew how criminals actually operated in the digital world. Most cybersecurity experts worked for established firms and had too much to lose by joining an unproven startup. But then, Dr. Patel introduced me to Marcus James, and I knew I'd found someone special. Marcus James shared a first name with my cousin, but that's where the similarities ended. He was 26, African American, and had one of the most unconventional backgrounds I'd ever encountered. He'd started hacking when he was 12, not for profit, but for the intellectual challenge. By the time he was 16, he was breaking into corporate networks just to prove he could, always leaving behind detailed reports about the vulnerabilities he'd exploited. He got caught eventually, arrested at 17 for infiltrating a major bank security system, even though he'd never stolen any money or compromised any customer data. The judge gave him a choice: 5 years in juvenile detention or 5 years of community service working with cybersecurity firms to improve their defenses. Marcus chose community service, and it changed his life. He spent his late teens working with some of the best ethical hackers in the world, learning how to channel his skills toward protecting people instead of just proving points. By the time I met him, he'd helped dozens of companies strengthen their security systems and had never crossed the line into actual criminal activity again. "Why should I trust you?" he asked when I explained my project. We were meeting in his tiny apartment in Somerville, surrounded by computer equipment and programming books. Most rich kids I've met who want to change the world are just playing around until they get bored and go work for daddy's company. It was a fair question. And honestly, I didn't have a perfect answer except to show him what I'd already built and let him see for himself that this wasn't a game for me. Marcus spent 2 hours going through my code, testing my algorithms, and asking technical questions that pushed my system to its limits. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "This is actually good," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Like really good, but you're thinking too small." "What do you mean? You're focused on detecting fraud after transactions happen, even if it's in real time. But what if you could prevent the transactions from happening in the first place? What if your AI could identify suspicious patterns and automatically implement protective measures before any damage is done?" That conversation lasted until 3 in the morning, and by the end of it, we'd sketched out a system that was far more ambitious and powerful than anything I'd originally envisioned. Marcus agreed to join the team, but only after making me promise that we'd never compromise ethical standards for commercial success. I've seen what happens when smart people convince themselves that breaking rules is okay if it's for a good cause, he said. I won't be part of that again. Neither will I promised him. And I meant that too. The third member of our team came from an even more unexpected place. Owen Mitchell was a user experience designer who'd been fired from 3 different tech companies for what his managers called an inability to work within established frameworks. I found him through Layla, who'd worked with him on a freelance project, and described him as the most creative problem solver she'd ever met, and also the most stubborn. Owen was 31, tall and lanky, with prematurely gray hair that he blamed on years of arguing with corporate executives who didn't understand good design. He'd studied fine arts before transitioning into tech, and he brought an artist's sensibility to the challenge of making complex software accessible to ordinary users. Most AI interfaces are designed by engineers for engineers, he explained when I showed him our early prototypes. They assume users want to see every piece of data and understand every algorithmic decision. But what if we designed this for normal human beings who just want to know whether they should be worried about something? Owen's approach was revolutionary. Instead of overwhelming users with technical details, he designed interfaces that communicated risk and recommendations through intuitive visual patterns. A financial institution's security team could look at his dashboard and immediately understand their vulnerability level trending risks and recommended actions without needing a PhD in computer science. People make better decisions when they understand what they're looking at, he said. And they trust systems more when those systems can explain themselves in human language. With Owen on board, we had everything we needed: Layla's mathematical brilliance, Marcus's security expertise, Owen's design vision, and my business understanding and AI foundation. We called ourselves Guardian AI, and we set up shop in a converted warehouse in Somerville that cost a fraction of what a downtown Boston office would have cost. The next 6 months were the most intense period of my life. We worked 18-hour days, survived on coffee and takeout, and gradually built something that none of us could have created alone. The technical challenges were enormous. We needed to process millions of transactions in real time, identify patterns that might indicate emerging fraud schemes, and provide actionable intelligence to financial institutions without creating an overwhelming number of false positives. But the bigger challenge was strategic. We were trying to enter a market dominated by established players with deep pockets and long-standing relationships with major banks. We needed to prove not just that our technology worked, but that it was worth the risk of partnering with an unknown startup. That's when I made a decision that would have horrified my parents if they'd known about it. I decided to use the Clarke name, but not in the way they would have expected. I registered our company under the name Clarke Technologies, listing myself as the founder and CEO using only my first initial. To the outside world, Clarke could have been anyone. Isaac, Ian, Irving, or even Isabel. The ambiguity was intentional. My family name opened doors that would have remained closed to Bella Clarke, 23-year-old recent graduate with no business experience. But Clarke, with the right credentials and the right connections, could get meetings with angel investors who specialized in fintech startups. The first investor I approached was Elena Rodriguez, a former Goldman Sachs executive who'd started her own venture capital fund focused on financial technology. She'd made her fortune identifying disruptive technologies before they became mainstream, and she had a reputation for taking calculated risks on unconventional entrepreneurs. "Tell me about your background," she said when I walked into her downtown office. I was dressed in my most conservative business suit, carrying a leather portfolio that had belonged to my father, trying to project an image of competence and reliability. "I have a computer science degree from MIT with a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning," I said, which was completely true. "I've spent the last 2 years developing predictive algorithms for financial fraud detection, and I believe I've created something that could fundamentally change how the industry approaches cybersecurity." I didn't mention my age, my family connections, or my previous startup failure. I let my technology speak for itself. The demonstration went perfectly. Our system analyzed 6 months of transaction data from a mid-sized bank and identified 3 separate fraud schemes that had cost the institution over $2 million. More importantly, it predicted 2 emerging threats that hadn't been detected by their existing security systems. "This is impressive," Elena said when the presentation ended. "But I have to ask, what's your commercialization strategy? How do you plan to scale this technology across the financial industry?" That's when I revealed the partnership model I'd been developing. Instead of trying to compete with established cybersecurity vendors, Guardian AI would work with financial institutions as a strategic intelligence partner. We'd provide predictive analysis and threat assessment while existing security teams handled implementation and response. "You're not trying to replace their current systems," Elena said, understanding immediately. "You're trying to make those systems smarter." "Exactly. And because our approach is predictive rather than reactive, we can help institutions prevent losses instead of just minimizing them after attacks have already begun." Elena leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of intense focus that made me understand why she'd been so successful on Wall Street. Clarke," she said finally, "I think you might be onto something revolutionary here, but I need to understand your team, your development timeline, and your funding requirements." Over the next hour, I walked her through everything: our technical capabilities, our go-to-market strategy, our projected milestones for the next 18 months. I explained how we'd assembled a team of unconventional but brilliant experts, how we'd validated our technology with real-world data, and how we plan to establish partnerships with early adopter institutions. "We're looking for 20 million in Series A funding," I said finally. "Enough to scale our development team, enhance our computational infrastructure, and establish pilot programs with 5 major financial institutions." It was an audacious ask for a company that hadn't made a single dollar in revenue yet. But Elena had seen our technology in action, and she understood the potential market opportunity. "I'll need to do due diligence on your team and your technology," she said, "but I'm interested, very interested." 3 weeks later, Elena called with news that would change everything. "Clarke," she said, "Catalyst Ventures would like to lead your Series A round. $20 million with the possibility of additional funding based on performance milestones." I hung up the phone and walked out to the main floor of our warehouse office, where Layla was debugging algorithms, Marcus was analyzing threat intelligence, and Owen was refining user interfaces. "We got it," I said quietly. They looked up from their computers, not quite understanding at first. "We got the funding," I said louder this time. $20 million. We're actually doing this." The celebration that followed was probably the happiest moment of my life up to that point. 4 people who'd been told they didn't fit into traditional corporate structures. 4 outsiders who'd found each other and built something extraordinary together. But even as we celebrated, I knew this was just the beginning. We had the funding, we had the technology, and we had the team. Now we had to prove that Guardian AI could deliver on its promises, that we could scale our vision into something that would actually change the world. And we had to do it all while my family continued to think I was wasting my time on some kind of extended sabbatical, drifting aimlessly, while my cousin Marcus established himself as the future of the Clarke legacy. They had no idea that their aimless daughter had just secured more funding than most startups see in their entire lifetimes. They had no idea that I, Clarke, was about to become one of the most important names in financial technology. But they'd find out soon enough. Very, very soon. Which brings us back to tonight. Back to this glittering ballroom, back to the crystal chandeliers, and the imported champagne, back to Marcus and his smug certainty about my wasted potential. 18 months had passed since I'd secured funding for Guardian AI. 18 months of building, scaling, and proving that our technology could deliver on its promises. 18 months, during which my family had continued to view my sabbatical with a mixture of disappointment and bewilderment. They had no idea that Guardian AI had grown from 4 people in a converted warehouse to a team of 47 across 3 offices. They didn't know that we'd established partnerships with 12 major financial institutions, that our technology was protecting over $300 billion in assets, or that we'd prevented fraud losses totaling over $800 million in just the past year. Most importantly, they had no idea that Forbes magazine had spent the last 6 weeks preparing a cover story about Clarke, the mysterious entrepreneur who'd revolutionized financial security and become the youngest billionaire in American history. But I knew I'd been carrying that secret around for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment to let the truth come to light. Marcus's comment about still roaming aimlessly had provided that moment perfectly. I was still standing there watching him walk away with his characteristic swagger when I noticed one of the Metropolitan Club's valets approaching our section of the ballroom. He was carrying a silver tray with what appeared to be an envelope, looking around as if searching for someone specific. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the table where my parents were holding court with several other financial power couples. "I'm looking for Miss Isabella Clarke." My mother looked up with mild surprise. "That's my daughter." "She's right over there!" The valet made his way through the crowd toward me, still carrying his silver tray with ceremonial precision. Several people turned to watch, curious about what kind of communication couldn't wait until after the gala. "Miss Clarke," he said when he reached me, "this was delivered for you this evening with instructions that it was urgent and time-sensitive." I accepted the envelope, noting the return address immediately. Forbes Media LLC. This was it. The advance copy they'd promised to send before the official publication tomorrow morning. "Thank you," I said to the valet, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my system. I turned the envelope over in my hands, acutely aware that several family members and their associates were watching with curious expressions. My mother had that look she got when she was trying to determine whether something might embarrass the family, while my father seemed mildly intrigued by the mysterious delivery. Marcus, who'd been engaged in conversation with a hedge fund manager, glanced over with obvious amusement. "What's that, Bella?" he called out loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. "Finally getting eviction notices from your startup office." A few people chuckled politely at his joke. Marcus always knew exactly how to deliver a cutting remark that sounded playful enough to avoid appearing cruel, but sharp enough to draw blood. I looked at the envelope again, then at Marcus with his confident smirk, then at my parents with their expressions of resigned disappointment. I thought about all the formal dinners, where my achievements had been dismissed as hobbies, all the family gatherings, where my choices had been questioned, all the subtle and not so subtle suggestions as that I was wasting my life and embarrassing the family name. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not just the 18 months since I'd started Guardian AI, but the years since college when I'd first realized that my vision of success didn't align with my family's expectations. "Actually," I said, opening the envelope with deliberate care, "I think you'll find this rather interesting." I pulled out the magazine, keeping the cover facing toward me for the moment. The weight of it felt significant in my hands, like I was holding the culmination of everything I'd worked for. "What is it?" my mother asked, moving closer with that mix of curiosity and apprehension that characterized her approach to anything unexpected. "It's next week's issue of Forbes," I said simply. "They sent me an advance copy." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced now. "Forbes? Why would Forbes send you anything?" I turned the magazine around so the cover was visible to everyone at our table. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. There, on the cover of the most prestigious business magazine in America, was a photograph of me. Not the Bella they thought they knew, the aimless daughter who couldn't find her place in the world, but a confident professional woman in a tailored blazer standing in front of Guardian AI's headquarters with the Manhattan skyline gleaming behind her. The headline was even more stunning. Clarke, the mysterious billionaire redefining financial security. How a 24-year-old MIT graduate built an AI empire in secret. The subheading read, "Guardian AI's predictive fraud prevention technology has revolutionized cybersecurity for major financial institutions, making founder Isabella Clarke the youngest self-made billionaire in American history. My mother was the first to react, her champagne flute slipping from her fingers and shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. The golden liquid spread across the white stone like spilled sunlight. "That's—" she started, then stopped, her eyes moving from the magazine cover to my face and back again as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. My father had gone completely still, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pride, though it was hard to tell in the dim ballroom lighting. Marcus, meanwhile, looked like someone had just told him that gravity had reversed and water now flowed upward. His mouth was actually hanging open, which was probably the first time in his life that he'd been genuinely speechless. "Bella," my father said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this real?" "Very real," I confirmed, handing him the magazine so he could examine it more closely. Guardian AI is the company I've been building during my so-called aimless sabbatical. We've revolutionized predictive fraud detection for the financial industry, and we're currently valued at just over $4.2 billion. The number hung in the air like something physical. $4.2 billion. More than Clarke and Associates had made in profit over the past 5 years combined. Other people at nearby tables had begun to notice the commotion, craning their necks to see what had caused such a dramatic reaction from one of the most composed families in the room. I could see servers pausing in their rounds, guests interrupting their conversations, even the orchestra seeming to play a little more quietly, as if sensing that something significant was happening. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident baritone. You're a billionaire." "Technically," I said, "I'm worth about $4.7 billion as of the last valuation. But who's counting?" The casualness of my response seemed to shock him even more than the initial revelation. This was Marcus, who'd built his entire identity around being the financial prodigy of the family. Discovering that his supposedly aimless cousin had quietly accumulated more wealth than he'd ever dreamed of achieving. "How is this possible?" my mother asked, finally recovering enough to form complete sentences. "We would have known. There would have been news coverage, SEC filing something." "There has been news coverage," I said. "Quite a lot of it, actually, but I've been operating under the name Clarke Technologies. Nobody connected the dots to our family until Forbes decided to do this profile piece." I watched as understanding dawned on their faces. All those articles about the mysterious Clarke who disrupted the cybersecurity industry. All those business journal profiles of the reclusive tech entrepreneur who was transforming financial protection. All those venture capital announcements about record-breaking funding rounds for AI startups. It had been me. All of it. The Forbes article is fascinating. I continued, pulling out my phone to show them the digital version that had just gone live. They interviewed Elena Rodriguez from Catalyst Ventures, Dr. Aaron Patel from MIT, even some executives from the banks we're protecting. Everyone seems quite impressed with what we've accomplished. My father was reading the magazine article with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for market analysis reports. I could see his expression changing as he absorbed the details of what Guardian AI had built, the scope of our partnerships, the revolutionary nature of our technology. "This says you've prevented over $800 million in fraud losses," he said, looking up at me with something approaching awe. "That's more than most cybersecurity companies prevent in a decade." "We've been busy," I said simply. Marcus was still staring at the magazine cover like it might disappear if he blinked. "But how did you— I mean, you don't have business experience. You've never managed a large team or dealt with major clients or—" "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I've been managing a team of 47 people across 3 offices for the past year. Our client list includes JP Morgan Chase Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs, among others. I've personally closed partnership deals worth over $200 million. Each fact landed like a small explosion in the conversation. This wasn't just success. This was success on a scale that dwarfed anything anyone in our family had achieved, accomplished by the person they'd all written off as a dreamer who couldn't focus on practical matters. The broader Gala crowd had begun to take notice of our table now. I could see people pulling out their phones, probably looking up the Forbes article that had just gone live. Word was starting to spread through the ballroom that Isabella Clarke, the quiet daughter who'd been drifting aimlessly for the past year and a half, was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in American business. "I don't understand," my mother said, though her tone had shifted from confusion to something approaching admiration. "Why didn't you tell us? Why keep it secret?" It was a fair question, and I'd been preparing for it for months. Because, I said, I needed to prove to myself that I could do this. Not as Philip and Charlotte Clarke's daughter, not as someone born into privilege and connections, but as Isabella Clarke, MIT graduate with a vision for changing the world. I gestured around the ballroom at all the wealth and power and established success that surrounded us. Everyone here tonight achieved their success within existing systems, playing by rules that were written by previous generations. I wanted to write new rules to build something that had never existed before, to prove that innovation doesn't have to come from the established players. My father nodded slowly, and I could see understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "You wanted to know that your success was yours alone." "Exactly. And now I do know. Guardian AI exists because of the vision I had, the team I assembled, the technology we built together. The Clarke name might have opened some doors along the way, but what's behind those doors is something I created." Marcus was reading over my father's shoulder, now absorbing the details of our business model, our technical achievements, our client relationships. His expression had shifted from shock to something approaching respect, though I could tell he was still struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. "This is incredible, Bella," he said finally. "I mean, genuinely incredible. But why reveal it now? Why not continue operating in secret?" I smiled, thinking about all the careful planning that had led to this moment. Because Guardian AI is ready for the next phase of our growth. We're expanding internationally, developing new product lines, preparing for what will likely be the largest Series B funding round in fintech history. I paused, looking around the table at my family members, who were all hanging on my every word now. And because I wanted you all to know that when I said I knew exactly what I was doing, and exactly where I was going, I meant it. I wasn't being defensive or stubborn. I was being accurate. The orchestra had moved into a gentle waltz, and couples were beginning to make their way to the dance floor. But our table remained transfixed by the magazine, and the revelation that had just turned their understanding of family dynamics completely upside down. "Bella," my mother said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We thought we were looking out for your best interests, but we were really just protecting our own assumptions about what success looks like." It was more than I'd expected from her, and certainly more than I'd dared to hope for. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You raised me to be ambitious, to work hard, to never settle for less than excellence. I just applied those lessons in ways you didn't anticipate." My father handed the magazine back to me, but not before studying my photograph one more time. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. I should have said that more often over the past few years, but I'm saying it now. What you've accomplished is extraordinary. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Respect, certainly, but also something approaching humility. "You know what the craziest part is?" he said. "I've been reading about Clarke for months. There were articles in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review. I even mentioned some of your innovations to Uncle Philip as examples of how AI was disrupting traditional finance." He laughed, but it wasn't his usual confident boom. It was the sound of someone who just realized how much he didn't know about the world. "I was using your success as proof of my own expertise, and I had no idea it was actually you." The irony was perfect, and I couldn't help but smile. "Well," I said, "now you know, and now you also know that when I told you I wasn't aimless, I meant it quite literally." Around us, the gala continued its elegant rhythm. Champagne flutes clinked, conversations flowed, the orchestra played, and Manhattan's financial elite celebrated another successful evening of networking and philanthropy. But at our table, everything had changed. The family dynamics that had defined my entire life, the assumptions about success and tradition, and who belonged where in the hierarchy of achievement had all been fundamentally altered by a magazine cover, and the truth it revealed. I was no longer the wayward daughter who couldn't find her place in the family business. I was Isabella Clarke, founder and CEO of one of the most revolutionary companies in American finance, and a billionaire who'd earned every dollar through vision innovation and relentless hard work. The best part was this was still just the beginning. Guardian AI was about to announce partnerships that would expand our reach globally. We were developing new technologies that would revolutionize not just fraud detection, but financial forecasting, risk assessment, and investment analysis. And for the first time in my life, my family was ready to understand that the future they'd been so worried about me finding had actually been something I'd been building all along. The gala ended at midnight, but for the Clarke family, the real conversation was just beginning. By 1 a.m, we were back at the Fifth Avenue penthouse, gathered in my father's study, just as we had been so many times during my childhood. But this time, the dynamics were completely different. Instead of a family meeting to discuss my disappointing life choices, this was something I'd never experienced before, a conversation between equals. My father had loosened his bow tie and poured himself a generous whiskey. My mother had kicked off her heels and was curled up in the leather armchair she'd claimed as her own years ago. Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, still holding the Forbes magazine like it was evidence in a case he was trying to solve. And I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Central Park, bathed in streetlight, feeling like I was seeing this room for the first time. "I have to ask," my father said, swirling his whiskey thoughtfully. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what exactly?" I replied, though I knew what he meant. "This entire evening. The timing of the Forbes article, the way you revealed everything tonight. It was perfectly orchestrated." I smiled, turning away from the window to face him. "You taught me to be strategic, Dad. You always said that timing was everything in business." "I did say that," he admitted. "I just never expected you to use that lesson to completely upend my understanding of my own daughter." There was a long pause filled with the kind of weighted silence that comes when people are trying to figure out how to talk to each other in a completely new context. "Bella," my mother said finally, "I need to understand something. When you were building this company, when you were raising money and hiring employees and negotiating with major banks, were you angry with us? Was this some kind of rebellion against the family expectations?" It was a question I'd been expecting, and I'd thought carefully about how to answer it. "No," I said, moving to sit across from her. "I wasn't angry. I was determined. There's a difference." I looked around the room at these three people who'd shaped my entire understanding of success and ambition and what it meant to be a Clarke. "You raised me to believe that our family stands for excellence, for innovation, for being leaders in whatever field we choose to enter. But somewhere along the way, you started confusing tradition with stagnation, confusing proven methods with the only methods." My father leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "We were trying to protect you from making mistakes. The business world is brutal, especially for young people who don't understand how things really work." "But Dad," I said gently, "what if how things really work is changing? What if the old rules don't apply anymore?" I pulled out my phone and showed them Guardian AI's client dashboard, scrolling through real-time data from financial institutions around the world. "This is what our technology prevented just today," I said, pointing to a series of blocked fraud attempts. $67 million in potential losses stopped before any damage was done. Our AI identified patterns that human analysts would have missed, predicted attacks that traditional security systems couldn't see coming. The numbers were impressive, but more than that, they represented something fundamental: proof that innovation could create value in ways that traditional approaches simply couldn't match. "The financial industry is being disrupted whether we acknowledge it or not," I continued. Some in blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of these developments are going to transform how banking and investment work. The question isn't whether change is coming. The question is whether established firms like Clark and Associates will lead that change or be swept away by it. My father was quiet for a long moment, studying the data on my phone screen. When he looked up, his expression was more serious than I'd seen it in years. "You're right," he said simply, "and that terrifies me." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me about his business, and it caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked. He stood up and walked to his desk, picking up a leather-bound folder that I recognized as one of his quarterly reports. "I've been watching these trends for the past few years," he admitted. AI trading algorithms, automated investment platforms, robo-advisors that can provide financial planning services for a fraction of what human advisors charge. Every month, there's some new technology that threatens to make our traditional approach obsolete. He opened the folder, revealing pages of analysis and market projections that painted a concerning picture for traditional investment firms. Our client retention is down 12% over the past 2 years. Not because we're providing bad service, but because younger clients are moving to tech-driven platforms that offer lower fees and more transparency. Our profit margins are shrinking because we're competing against algorithms that can process information faster than our best analysts. I'd suspected that Clark and Associates was facing competitive pressure, but I hadn't realized how serious the situation had become. "Why didn't you ever talk to me about this?" I asked. My father looked almost embarrassed. "Because I didn't want to admit that I might not understand the solution. I've spent 30 years building expertise in traditional finance, and now I'm watching that expertise become less valuable every quarter." Marcus, who'd been unusually quiet throughout this conversation, finally spoke up. "Uncle Philip, why didn't you tell me about these challenges? I would have started researching technological solutions, developing strategies to adapt our services." "Because, Marcus," my father said with a tired smile, "you're brilliant at optimizing existing systems, but you think like I think. You approach problems the way I would approach them. What we needed was someone who could see possibilities that we couldn't see." He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between regret and admiration. What we needed was Bella's perspective, and instead of encouraging her to apply that perspective to our challenges, we spent years trying to convince her to think more like us. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over everyone. All those family dinners where my interests had been dismissed, all those conversations where my ideas had been treated as impractical, all those subtle and not so subtle suggestions that I should focus on more traditional career paths. "I have something to confess," my mother said quietly. "I've been researching Guardian AI since we got home tonight, reading articles, looking at your company website, trying to understand what you've actually built." She pulled out her own phone, showing me a financial analysis she'd apparently been working on while I was talking with my father. "Your business model is extraordinary," she said. "You're not just providing a service, you're creating an entirely new category of financial protection. And your growth trajectory is unlike anything I've seen in traditional finance." She looked up at me with something approaching awe. "Bella, do you realize that Guardian AI is positioned to become one of the most valuable companies in the financial sector, not just among startups, but among all financial services firms?" "I do realize that," I said. "It's why I've been so focused on building the right foundation, assembling the right team, establishing the right partnerships. We're not just trying to be successful, we're trying to be transformational." Marcus was reading over my mother's shoulder, studying her analysis with the kind of intense focus I remembered from our childhood. "This is incredible," he said finally. "Bella, I owe you a huge apology. I've been treating your work like some kind of hobby, but you've actually built something that could revolutionize the entire industry." He looked up at me with an expression that mixed respect with what might have been embarrassment. "I've been so focused on climbing the ladder within existing systems that I never stopped to consider whether those systems were going to survive long term. You saw the future and built it. I just kept optimizing for the past. Marcus, I said, you're incredibly talented. Your understanding of traditional finance is remarkable, and your analytical skills are first rate. But talent applied to declining systems produces declining results. I moved to the whiteboard that my father kept in his study for sketching out investment strategies, picking up a marker to illustrate my point. The financial industry is going through the same transformation that happened to retail, to media, to transportation. Digital technologies aren't just making existing processes more efficient, they're enabling entirely new approaches that make old approaches obsolete. I drew a simple diagram showing how artificial intelligence could transform various aspects of financial services: fraud detection, risk assessment, investment analysis, client communications, regulatory compliance. Guardian AI started with fraud detection because that was the most urgent need, but we're already expanding into predictive analytics for investment management, automated compliance monitoring, and personalized financial planning. Within 5 years, we'll be providing AI-enhanced services across every aspect of financial management. My father studied the diagram with the kind of intense interest he usually reserved for major client presentations. And traditional firms that don't adapt? He asked. They'll become increasingly irrelevant, I said honestly. Not because they're bad at what they do, but because what they do won't be what clients need anymore. The truth hung in the air like a challenge. Clarke & Associates, the firm that had been the foundation of our family's success for 4 generations, was facing an existential threat from the same technological revolution that had made me a billionaire. So, what do we do? Marcus asked. How does a traditional investment firm compete with AI-driven platforms that can provide better services at lower costs? I looked at him, then at my parents, then back at the whiteboard where I'd sketched out the future of financial services. You don't compete with them, I said. You partner with them. The suggestion seemed to surprise everyone, but I'd been thinking about this possibility for months. Guardian AI has the technology and the innovation, but we're still a young company with limited experience in some areas of traditional finance. Clarke & Associates has decades of client relationships, regulatory expertise, and industry credibility, but you need technological capabilities to remain competitive. I turned back to the whiteboard, sketching out a potential partnership structure. What if we explored the ways to combine Guardian AI's technology with Clarke & Associates' traditional strengths? Not a merger, not an acquisition, but a strategic partnership that leverages both companies' advantages. Marcus leaned forward, suddenly engaged in a way I hadn't seen from him all evening. You mean like offering AI-enhanced investment analysis to our existing clients, while Guardian AI gains access to traditional institutional knowledge? Exactly. We could develop pilot programs where Clarke & Associates clients get early access to our new technologies, while we learn from your expertise in client relations and regulatory compliance. My father was nodding slowly, his strategic mind clearly working through the possibilities. It would give us a competitive advantage over other traditional firms who are struggling to adapt, he said, and it would give Guardian AI credibility with more conservative institutional clients who might be hesitant to trust a pure technology company with their financial security. The key, I added, is that it would be a partnership between equals. Guardian AI isn't looking to be acquired or absorbed. We're looking to collaborate with firms that understand both the value of innovation and the importance of maintaining client trust. My mother had been quiet during this exchange, but I could see her processing the implications of what we were discussing. This could work, she said finally, but it would require both companies to operate differently than they have before. Clarke & Associates would need to embrace technological solutions we don't fully understand yet, and Guardian AI would need to work within regulatory frameworks that might seem restrictive compared to the startup world. True, I acknowledged. But the alternative is both companies trying to succeed in isolation, while the industry transforms around us. Collaboration seems like a better strategy than competition. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights, while he thought through what we'd discussed. You know what's funny, he said finally. For the past 2 years, I've been telling Uncle Philip that Clark and Associates needed to embrace new technologies to stay competitive. But I was thinking about incremental improvements, better software for existing processes. I never imagined anything as revolutionary as what you've built. He turned back to face us, and I could see a new kind of respect in his expression. Bella, I've spent my entire career trying to prove that I could uphold the Clark family legacy, but you've actually redefined what that legacy could be. It was the most generous thing Marcus had ever said to me, and I felt something shift in our relationship that had been locked in place since childhood. Marcus, the legacy isn't about any one person or any one approach. It's about excellence, innovation, and leadership. There's room for both traditional expertise and technological innovation in that legacy. My father raised his whiskey glass as if preparing for a toast, then paused. Bella, there's something I need to say. For the past 18 months, I've been worried that you were drifting away from the family, that you were rejecting everything we tried to teach you about business and success. He looked around the room at his wife, his nephew, and his daughter, who'd apparently become a billionaire while he wasn't paying attention. But tonight, I realized that you weren't rejecting our lessons. You were applying them in ways we were too narrow-minded to appreciate. You identified an enormous market opportunity, assembled an exceptional team, raised significant capital, and built a company that's revolutionizing an entire industry. He smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile that held no reservations about my choices. Those are exactly the skills we tried to teach you. You just used them to build something we couldn't envision. My mother stood up and walked over to me, taking my hands in hers with a gentleness I hadn't experienced since childhood. I'm sorry, she said simply. I'm sorry for all the times we made you feel like your dreams weren't practical, like your interests weren't valuable, like your vision of success wasn't legitimate. She paused and I could see tears forming in her eyes. You were right, and we were wrong, and I'm incredibly proud of the woman you've become. It was everything I'd wanted to hear from her for years, and more than I dared to hope for. I want to understand your work, she continued. I want to visit your offices, meet your team, learn about the technology you've developed. Not because I want to interfere or offer unwanted advice, but because I want to understand the world you've created. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. I'd love that too, and if there are ways that my traditional finance background could be useful to Guardian AI's expansion plans, I'd be honored to contribute. I looked around the room at these three people who'd shaped my entire understanding of ambition and success, who'd frustrated me and challenged me, and ultimately prepared me for exactly the kind of entrepreneurial success I'd achieved. You know what? I said. Why don't you all come visit Guardian AI's headquarters next week? I'd love to show you what we've built. Introduce you to my team. Demonstrate our technology in action. Waiter, I smiled, thinking about how different that visit would be from all those family discussions, where I'd tried to explain my vision and been met with polite skepticism. It'll be the first time I've been able to invite my family into my professional world as an equal, not as someone asking for approval or understanding, but as someone sharing something I'm proud of. My father raised his whiskey glass again, and this time he completed the gesture. To tradition that evolves, he said, with those brave enough to innovate. We all raised our glasses, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I truly belonged in this family. Not because I'd conformed to their expectations, but because I'd exceeded them in ways they could finally recognize and appreciate. To the future, I added, and to building it together. As we drank to that toast, I realized that this was what success actually felt like. Not just the financial achievements or the industry recognition, but the moment when the people you love most finally understand that your dreams were worth pursuing, that your vision was worth building, that your path was worth taking. The Clarke family legacy hadn't been diminished by my unconventional choices. It had been expanded, enhanced, and prepared for a future that none of us could have imagined when I was growing up in this same study, listening to lectures about market fundamentals and corporate strategy. Tomorrow, Guardian AI would announce our Series B funding round the largest in fintech history. We'd reveal partnerships with international banks, expansion plans for European and Asian markets, and new technologies that would revolutionize financial services even further. But tonight, sitting in my father's study with my family, finally understanding what I'd been building all along, I felt like the most successful person in the world. Not because I'd proven them wrong, but because I'd proven that there was more than one way to honor a family legacy. Innovation and tradition weren't enemies. They were partners in creating a future worthy of the past while building something entirely new. Sometimes, the biggest risk is playing it safe. If you enjoyed this story of turning family disappointment into billion-dollar success, hit that subscribe button for more incredible tales of people who rewrote their own endings. What's your biggest dream that others call impossible? Let me know in the comments below.